In this lecture, we will discuss the potential use of Ebola virus as a weapon of mass destruction with regard to biological warfare and bioterrorism. You will recall that the first recorded incidence of Ebola virus infection in humans occurred in the village of Yambuku in Zaire in 1976. In spite of that fact, a 2014 North Korean news editorial claimed that the United States may have developed the Ebola virus and intentionally allowed it to spread throughout West Africa and the rest of the world for the purposes of generating profits from an Ebola vaccine, as well as to weaken other countries for its own political gain. Realistically, though, how likely is it that Ebola virus could be used as an agent of biological warfare or bioterrorism? Recall again that Ebola virus is classified as a biosafety level 4 biohazard. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention also classifies EBOV as a Category A bioterrorism agent. So what does that mean? Well, first a little background. Biological warfare, also known as germ warfare, is the use of biological toxins or infectious agents such as bacteria, viruses, and fungi with the intent to kill or incapacitate humans, animals, or plants, and as an act of war. Biological weapons are living organisms. Well, that includes viruses, which are technically not living organisms. They're really just tiny packages of infectious protein. But nonetheless, these organic entities replicate within their host victims. Now, biological warfare represents the B in the NBC, or nuclear, biological, and chemical warfare triad. Now, NBC makes use of weapons of mass destruction rather than conventional incendiary devices to render harm to an identified enemy. Historically, biological warfare has been practiced for more than 1,000 years. The Assyrians, in fact, poisoned enemy wells with a fungus during the 6th century. And in 1346, the plague-ridden bodies of warriors were thrown over the walls of the besieged Crimean city of Kaffa. Now, the Imperial German Army used anthrax in their war efforts in the mid-1900s, though the effects of their efforts were less than noteworthy. Nevertheless, the use of non-conventional warfare had become so commonplace that the Geneva Protocol of 1925 prohibited the use in war of asphyxiating, poisonous, or other gases and of bacteriological methods of warfare. During World War II, researchers in Great Britain, under approval of Prime Minister Winston Churchill, were able to weaponize anthrax and botulinum toxins, among others, even though the British military never used their biological stockpile during the war. The United States, after entering the war, created its own biological weapons research program at Fort Detrick, Maryland. Biological and chemical weapons were tested, and while mass production of anthrax and botulinum toxins was initiated, the war ended before the United States could deploy its biological arsenal. Undoubtedly, the most notorious biochemical warfare program of the 1940s was conducted by the Imperial Japanese Army's Secret Unit 731, led by the infamous Lieutenant General Shiroishi. Unit 731 conducted research on and development of biological weapons and their effects on humans. The unit tested the effects of their weapons on captured prisoners. In fact, their level of brutality was unprecedented and even included live human dissections. Japan used biological weapons indiscriminately against both Chinese soldiers and civilians. In one operation, the Japanese Army Air Force was tasked with dropping ceramic bombs full of fleas infected with Yersinia pestis. Yersinia pestis is a causative agent of bubonic plague. Ironically, in one campaign, some 10,000 Japanese troops contracted the plague, and nearly 2,000 soldiers died as their flea bombs figuratively backfired. Interestingly, in the spring of 1945, Shiroishi brainstormed a plan to attack the west coast of the United States with his biological weapons. Operation Cherry Blossoms at Night was set to commence in September. Japanese air crews, launched from submarines, would unleash plague-ridden fleas on California. Now, one of the Japanese pilots said this in an interview in 1989. I was told directly by Shiroishi of the kamikaze mission Cherry Blossoms at Night, which was named by Ishii himself. I was a leader of a squad of 17, and I understood that the mission was to spread contaminated fleas in the enemy's base and contaminate them with plague. Now, fortunately for the United States, the Japanese surrender on August 15th effectively thwarted Shiraishi's diabolical mission. In 1969, United States President Richard Nixon officially terminated the bulk production of biological weapons while approving only that continued development which would satisfy scientific research for defensive measures. Then in 1972, the Biological and Toxin Weapons Convention was signed by the United States, the United Kingdom, and the then Soviet Union, as well as a number of other nations, to ban the development, production, and stockpiling of microbes or their poisonous products except in amounts necessary for protective and peaceful research. Okay, so where does all of that leave us with regard to Ebola? You will remember that biological warfare is the use of biological agents or bioagents by a formally recognized nation in a defensive manner. By contrast, bioterrorism is the unlawful, deliberate, and indiscriminate use of bioagents to cause illness or death in people, animals, or plants with the intent to create fear and intimidate governments or societies in the pursuit of political, religious, or ideological goals. Now, terrorists like using bioagents due to the fact that they are relatively inexpensive and easy to obtain. They can be easily disseminated. They may cause widespread and profound fear and panic, so their effects go far beyond the physical damage, and they are difficult to detect and track as they may not elicit obvious disease symptoms for several hours or even days. And remember that victims of Ebola virus infection may not become symptomatic for up to 21 days. So that's a lot of time for a bioagent to cause its deadly effects before it can even be tracked. Now, in the United States, bioagents which have been declared by the United States Department of Health and Human Services or the United States Department of Agriculture to have the potential to pose a severe threat to public health and safety are designated select agents. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention administers the Select Agent Program, which regulates laboratories which may possess, use, or transfer select agents within the United States. Now, CDC places select agents in one of three categories, A, B, or C, according to, among other factors, the agent's ease of transmission, ease of dissemination, mortality rate, and degree of impact on public health. So, Category A select agents are those which pose a significant risk to national security, can be easily transmitted and disseminated, result in high mortality, have potential major public health impact, may cause public panic, and/or require special action of public health preparedness. Now, that includes educating the public on the dangers of a pathogen and personal preventive techniques. So, Category A select agents then include Bacillus anthracis, that's the causative agent of anthrax, Variola major, causative agent of smallpox, Clostridium botulinum, that's botulism, Yersinia pestis, that's bubonic plague, and of course Ebola virus, causative agent of Ebola virus disease. Of significant note here with regard to bioterrorism in the United States are two incidences. The first is the Rajneesh bioterror attack. So in 1984, followers of Indian mystic Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh attempted to control a local election in Oregon, USA, by spreading salmonella bacterium in restaurant salad bars, on the produce at grocery stores, and on doorknobs in public places throughout the city of the Dalles, Oregon. While no deaths resulted, 751 people ended up contracting salmonella, a severe form of food poisoning, as the Rajneesh attack of 1984 would go down in American history as the first bioterrorism event of the 20th century in the United States. Now, the second significant U.S. bioterror event occurred in 2001. The case was designated Amerithrax by the FBI, and it occurred in September and October 2001, shortly after the attacks of 9/11. Amerithrax involved a powder of military-grade anthrax spores being mailed to 3 news agencies and the offices of 2 United States senators. This FBI investigation became, quote, one of the largest and most complex in the history of law enforcement, end quote. In early April 2005, investigators narrowed their focus down to one suspect, Bruce Edwards Ivins, who worked as a scientist in the government's biodefense lab at, wouldn't you know it, Fort Detrick in Frederick, Maryland. 2 years later, Ivins was placed under FBI surveillance as an extremely sensitive suspect in the 2001 Anthrax Attacks. Finally, in 2008, after DNA evidence led investigators to an anthrax vial in his lab, federal prosecutors declared Ivins to be the sole culprit of the 2001 bioterror attack. Now, this was perhaps the proverbial too little too late, as Ivins died of an intentional overdose earlier in July. Now, all told, 5 anthrax-laden letters were received, presumed to be mailed from the same postal location in New Jersey. At least 17 people were infected. 5 deaths were attributed to anthrax exposure. No United States political leaders were harmed. While the handwritten letters hinted at an al-Qaeda connection, no such connection was ever established. The FBI determined that Ivins worked alone, and the FBI closed the Amerithrax case in February 2010. Now, our discussion of bioterrorism here begs the question then, how likely is the use of Ebola virus as a mechanism for bioterror activity in the future? Indeed, has Ebola virus already been used in this capacity? Remember that Ebola virus disease is 25 to 90% fatal, with an average fatality of 50%. So Ebola virus could potentially make an effective bioweapon. 2, there is neither a cure nor an approved vaccination for Ebola virus disease. You must remember, though, that Ebola virus is just that. It's a virus. So as a virus, EBOV is extremely fragile outside of the living host, and therefore would be incredibly difficult to weaponize and disseminate via conventional means. Now, spore-forming pathogens like Bacillus anthracis, as we have just seen, are comparatively easy to duplicate and subsequently disseminate, as in the Amerithrax case. Because there is currently no approved vaccine or other prophylactic measure, which would, of course, prevent those preparing the pathogen from contracting the deadly infection, Ebola virus might not be the ideal pathogen for biowarfare or bioterror activity. So, while we presume that no group has obtained EBOV for the heinous purpose of inflicting terror upon another, Russia has investigated the use of filoviruses in biowarfare. Now, in the early years of this century, a former Japanese terror cult, Aum Shinrikyo, I'm sure I just butchered that name, but the group was responsible for the deadly Tokyo subway sarin chemical attack in 1995, but they attempted to obtain Ebola virus cultures. Thankfully, they were not able to obtain those cultures, but they tried. Nevertheless, as you now understand, it is obviously not a great idea to use any pathogen in either an offensive or, dare I say, defensive way if there is no prophylactic measure to protect you or your own people from the effects of the pathogen. And you know now, at least at this moment in history, there is no such preventive measure for Ebola virus disease. Okay, so in our final lecture of this section, we will discuss the greater consequences of pandemics on the global economy. So I will see you shortly.